It was one of the greatest repositories of knowledge in human history, a monument to learning that has haunted scholars and historians for nearly 2,000 years. The Library of Alexandria. For centuries, the story we've been told is simple. It burned. Julius Caesar's fire. Christian mobs, Arab conquerors. Pick your villain. The narrative is always the same. One catastrophic moment when all human knowledge went up in flames, plunging civilization into darkness. But that story, repeated in textbooks and documentaries for generations, is a lie. The truth is far stranger, more complex, and in many ways more disturbing. The library didn't burn in a single apocalyptic inferno. It didn't vanish overnight. And the books, the precious scrolls containing the wisdom of the ancient world, didn't all perish in Alexandria. Thanks to recent scholarship, archaeological discoveries, and a careful re-examination of ancient texts, we now know what really happened. The story doesn't end in flames, it begins with a diaspora. In 145 BC, something unprecedented occurred in Alexandria. The reigning pharaoh, Ptolemy VIII, became embroiled in a brutal dynastic struggle. His rivals had the support of the city's intellectual elite, the scholars who lived and worked at the museum, the research institution that housed the Great Library. Ptolemy VIII saw these scholars as a threat to his power, so he made a decision that would echo through history. He expelled them, all of them. The chief librarian Aristarchus of Samothrace, who had created the authoritative editions of Homer that we still study today, was forced to flee. He escaped to the island of Cyprus, where he died in exile shortly after. But he wasn't alone. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of scholars were driven from Alexandria, scattered across the Mediterranean world. And they didn't leave empty-handed. When these scholars fled, they took something with them: their knowledge, their expertise, and crucially, copies of the text they had been studying. One of Aristarchus's students, a grammarian named Dionysius Thrax, established a new school on the Greek island of Rhodes. He brought with him his training, his methods, and the texts he had copied in Alexandria. There he wrote the first comprehensive guide to Greek grammar, a textbook that would be used for over 1,000 years. The knowledge didn't die, it migrated. This pattern repeated itself across the ancient world: Athens, Pergamon, Antioch, Rome. Former Alexandrian scholars established new centers of learning, founding schools, teaching students, copying manuscripts. What had been concentrated in one great library was now distributed across dozens of cities, hundreds of private collections. The centralized repository of knowledge had become a network. But here's what makes this discovery so important. For over a century, historians have debated a single question: did the Library of Alexandria really contain all the world's knowledge? Was its destruction truly the catastrophic loss we've been told it was? The answer, according to modern scholarship, is no, and the evidence comes from the texts themselves. When we examine the manuscripts that survived from the ancient world, the works of Homer, Euclid's Elements, the plays of Sophocles, Aristotle's writings, we find something remarkable. These texts didn't survive in single copies preserved by chance. They survived in multiple versions, with variations, annotations, and commentaries from different scholarly traditions. This tells us something crucial. These works existed in numerous copies scattered across the ancient Mediterranean. The Library of Alexandria was never the only repository. It was simply the largest and most prestigious. When the scholars were expelled in 145 BC, they didn't take unique, irreplaceable texts. They took copies of works that already existed elsewhere. The real question isn't what was lost when Alexandria declined. It's what was preserved because knowledge had already spread beyond its walls. Now we come to the fire. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar found himself trapped in Alexandria during Egypt's civil war. To escape, he ordered his men to set fire to enemy ships in the harbour. The flames spread. Ancient writers disagree on what happened next. Plutarch, writing over a century later, claimed the Great Library burned. But other sources are less certain. Some mention warehouses of grain and papyrus near the docks. Others speak of books destroyed, but not necessarily the library building itself. Here's what we know for certain. The library, or at least the institution of the museum, continued to function after 48 BC. The scholar Didymus Chalcedonus, nicknamed Bronze Guts, because he could work for hours without tiring, produced thousands of books in Alexandria in the decades following Caesar's fire. He was called Book Forgetter because even he couldn't remember everything he had written. He worked there, in Alexandria, using the library's resources for years after the fire that supposedly destroyed it all. So what really happened? Most likely Caesar's fire destroyed part of the collection. Perhaps books stored in warehouses near the harbour, perhaps some buildings associated with the library. But the main collection, housed in the museum complex, survived. The institution limped on. Then came the real catastrophe. Not a fire, not a mob. Neglect. The library had been funded by the Ptolemaic pharaohs, who poured vast resources into acquiring books, maintaining the collection, employing scholars. But in 30 BC, Cleopatra VII died, and Egypt became a Roman province. The Romans had their own libraries, their own intellectual centres in Rome and Athens. Alexandria was no longer special, funding dried up. Scholars left for better opportunities elsewhere. And here's the detail that changes everything. Papyrus scrolls rot. In the humid Mediterranean climate, they decompose within years. Not a single ancient papyrus scroll from the Mediterranean region has survived to the present day. Every ancient text we have comes from Egypt's dry desert climate or exists as later copies on parchment. To maintain a library in Alexandria, scribes would need to constantly produce fresh copies of every single text, year after year, decade after decade. This required money, materials, and skilled labour. Without the Ptolemies' patronage, that maintenance stopped. The scrolls began to decay. By the 3rd century AD, when the Emperor Aurelian recaptured Alexandria from the rebel queen Zenobia, the library district was destroyed in the fighting. But historians debate whether there was still a functioning library to destroy. The daughter library in the Serapeum Temple may have held some collection. When Christian Bishop Theophilus ordered the Serapeum demolished in 391 AD, ancient writers describe the destruction of the temple in vivid detail, but they don't mention books. The most detailed account of the temple's destruction spends 40% of its text mocking the pagan monks who defended it, calling them ignorant and foolish. Yet this same writer, who clearly despised these pagans, never mentions that they destroyed a library. Why? Most likely because there wasn't one left to destroy. Then 6 centuries later, a story emerged. Arab sources from the 12th and 13th centuries claimed that when Caliph Omar conquered Alexandria in 641 AD, he ordered all the library's books burned to heat the city's bathhouses. It supposedly took 6 months to burn them all. This story is a fabrication. It appears 600 years after the events it describes, and modern scholars have traced its origin. It was likely invented to justify Sultan Saladin's destruction of books he deemed heretical in Cairo during the 12th century. The story was then weaponized by European writers centuries later to paint Islam as anti-intellectual. But here's what actually happened to the knowledge. It survived, not in Alexandria, but everywhere else. During the Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th to 13th centuries, scholars in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba systematically translated Greek texts into Arabic. They preserved works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and Euclid. These translations eventually made their way back to Europe during the Renaissance, where they were translated again into Latin. Christian monasteries throughout the Middle Ages copied and preserved classical texts. Monks in Ireland, France, and Italy spent their lives transcribing works of Roman and Greek literature. When these manuscripts reached Renaissance scholars, they recognized them as treasures from the ancient world. What was lost, we can never know for certain, but scholars estimate that we possess about 10% of ancient Greek literature. Of the 78 plays Euripides wrote, only 18 survive. Of the 120 books comprising Livy's history of Rome, only 35 remain. We know the titles of hundreds of lost works only because other ancient authors quoted them. Mathematical treatises, scientific discoveries, entire philosophical schools, gone. But they weren't lost because the Library of Alexandria burned. They were lost because only 1 or 2 copies existed, scattered across the ancient world, and those individual copies didn't survive the centuries. Papyrus rotted. Parchment was scraped clean and reused. Wars destroyed cities. Libraries in Pergamon, Athens, and Rome suffered their own catastrophes. The knowledge preserved in multiple copies, distributed across many libraries, survived. The knowledge that existed in single copies, whether in Alexandria or anywhere else, vanished. This discovery transforms our understanding of the library's legacy. It wasn't the single point of failure for ancient knowledge. It was one node in a vast network of scholarship that spanned the Mediterranean world. When Alexandria declined, knowledge flowed elsewhere. The scholars who built that network, who copied texts, who established new schools in distant cities, they were the real heroes of preservation. The myth of the burning library serves a purpose. It gives us a villain to blame. Caesar, or Christians, or Muslims, depending on whose history we're reading. It suggests that human knowledge is fragile, that civilization can be destroyed in a single catastrophic moment. And there's truth in that warning, but the real lesson is more subtle. Knowledge survives through distribution, through networks, through the unglamorous work of copying and preserving and teaching. The Library of Alexandria didn't need to burn for its knowledge to be lost. It just needed to be abandoned, defunded, allowed to decay. And much of what we think was lost in Alexandria was actually preserved by the scholars who left, who built new libraries, who kept copying texts even when empires fell. The books didn't burn. They travelled. They dispersed. They transformed. And in that dispersal, enough survived to reshape the world. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe for more histories that challenge what you thought you knew about the ancient world.